Peregrine has some of the best prose I've ever read. Oftentimes I feel as though I read 100 pages of a book to find a single sentence I know I'll remember for the rest of my life. But the Peregrine is full of sentences like these, so today I wanted to share some of my favorite sentences with you, and I want to do so in a way that would promote rest, in a way that would be easy to sleep to. This is because The Peregrine has been the perfect bedside book for me for the past few months. As a text, it has no grand drama, you are never missing any meaning. The plot of the book, strictly speaking, is about a man following some peregrine falcons. But the meaning is not important. The words alone are like caramel. All of these make it a fantastic book to fall asleep to. Before we begin, I wanted to note that this book has many depictions of violence in the animal world because the main characters are peregrine falcons. If this is off-putting to you, it will be best to find another text. The rest of the video will have a black screen, and after every section, there will be a few seconds of silence. Let's begin. Cold air rises from the ground as the sun goes down. The eye-burning clarity of light intensifies. The southern rim of the sky glows to a deeper blue, to pale violet, to purple, then thins to grey. Slowly the wind falls, and the still air begins to freeze. The solid eastern ridge is black. It has a bloom on it like the dust on the skin of a grape. The west flares briefly. The long, cold amber of the afterglow casts clear black lunar shadows. There is an animal mystery in the light that sets upon the fields like a frozen muscle that will flex and wake at sunrise. I feel compelled to lie down in this numbing density of silence, to companion and comfort the dying in these cold depths at the foot of the solstice, those that have fled from the falcon in the sky, from the hawk in the dark of the wood, from the foxes, stoats, and weasels now running over the frozen fields, from the otter swimming in the icy brook, those whose blood now courses from the hunting frost, whose frail hearts choke in the clawed frost's bitter grip. The low afternoon sun shone upwards to the southward flying gulls. They seemed to be almost transparent, ethereal with the glowing and holy illumination that hollowed out their slender bones and threaded their airy marrow. Two dead herons lay in the snow together, like a pair of gaunt grey crutches, eyeless and tattered corpses, torn and shredded by many shapes of tooth and beak and claw. Otter tracks led to fish blood and the bones of a pike. The moorhen was dragged back and down under water by a pike that had lanced up at it through a hole in the ice. It tilted over and up and sank like a torpedoed ship. I stood by a wooden barn, weighing a frozen and shriveled white owl in my hand. I had lifted it down from a rafter as though it had been a flower pot. It was cold and dry and brittle, stale and long dead. Something hit the roof of the barn, slithered down, and fell at my feet. It was a wood pigeon. Blood welled from its eye like a red tear, and spread over its face in a horrifying lopsided circle. The other eye stared out, impelling the bird round in the snow. It clutched with its wings, half its brain already dead. When I lifted it up, it still kept turning like a toy train that is meaningless away from its rails. I killed it, threw it down in the snow, and walked on. The chattering, circling peregrine descended to its prey. The long, waning whiteness of the afternoon stained towards sunset. The sun was like a withered apple, shriveling, dying. Dusk shaded the sliding hill lanes under spruces alpine with snow. Fieldfares and redwings, a few tired birds, went down into the dark valley, perhaps for the last time. A tawny owl's song, tremulously baying, rang out from holly and pine. Night. A fox calling, blazing up before me in the torchlit snow, glaring from a grate of blood and pheasant feathers, red and copper shavings. A day of blood, of sun, snow, and blood, blood red. What a useless adjective that is. Nothing is as beautifully, richly red as flowing blood on snow. It is strange that the eye can love what mind and body hate. February 10th. This was a day made absolute. The sun unflawed, the blue sky pure. Slate roofs and crows' wings burned white like magnesium. The shining mauve and silver woods, snow-rooted, bit sharply black into the solid blueness of the sky. The air was cold. The wind rose from the north like cold fire. All was revealed, the moment of creation. A rainbow poured upon rock and shaped into woods and rivers. The peregrine flew north across the valley. He was half a mile away, but I could see the brown and black of his wings, the shining gold of his back, the pale cream of his tail coverts looked like a band of straw twined round the base of his tail. Thinking he would return downwind, I went into the fields by the river to watch for him. I stood in lee of a hawthorn hedge, looking through it to the north, sheltered from the bitter wind. By midday, small cumulus clouds were smoking up from the horizon. They were very white, but those that followed were grey and larger. Warm air was rising where snow had thawed. He hovered and stayed still, striding on the crumbling columns of air, curved wings jerking and flexing. 5 minutes he stayed there, fixed like a barb in the blue flesh of sky. His body was still and rigid, his head turned from side to side, his tail fanned open and shut, his wings whipped and shuddered like canvas in the lash of the wind. He side-slipped to his left, paused, and glided round and down into what could only be the beginning of a tremendous stoop. There was no mistaking the menace of that first easy drifting fall. Smoothly at an angle of 50 degrees, he descended, not slowly, but controlling his speed, gracefully, beautifully balanced. There was no abrupt change. The angle of his fall became gracefully steeper till there was no angle left, but only a perfect arc. He curved over and slowly revolved, as though for the light, glorying in anticipation of the dive to come. His feet opened and gleamed golden, clutching up towards the sun. He rolled over, and they dulled, and turned towards the ground beneath and closed again. For 1,000 feet he fell, and curved and slowly turned and tilted upright. Then his speed increased, and he dropped vertically down. He had another 1,000 feet to fall, but now he fell sheer, shimmering down through dazzling sunlight, heart-shaped, like a heart in flames. He became smaller and darker, diving down from the sun. The partridge in the snow beneath looked up at the black heart dilating down upon him, and heard a whiss of wings rising to a roar. In 10 seconds the hawk was down, and the whole splendid fabric, the arched reredos, an immense fan vaulting of his flight, was consumed and lost in the fiery maelstrom of the sky. A large area of snow had been trampled by their feet, the scaly rings and bumpy pads of the hawk's toes, which help it to grip its prey, had made deep dents in the snow. These odd, thick-toed, knobbly footprints are quite different from those of other birds. To rest my hand in the place where the peregrine had stood so recently was to experience a strong feeling of proximity, of identification. Footprints in snow are strangely moving. They seem almost a shameful betrayal of the creatures that make them, as though something of themselves had been left defenseless. The valley is covered with the footprints of birds that the cold weather has killed, pathetic memorials that the sun is slowly eroding. The peregrine has learned that warm air rises from the sunny, windless slopes of the lane, and he often flies there when he wishes to soar. Slowly he drifted above the orchid skyline and circled downwind, curving upward and round in long steep glides. He passed from the cold white sky of the south up to warm blue zenith, ascending the wind-bent thermal with wonderful ease and skill. His long-winged, blunt-headed shape contracted, dwindled, and darkened to the flinty point of a diamond as he circled high and over, hanging and drifting above, indolent, watchful, supreme. Looking down, the hawk saw the big orchid beneath him shrink into dark twiggy lines and green strips, saw the dark woods closing together and reaching out across the hills, saw the green and white fields turning brown, saw the silver line of the brook and the coiled river slowly uncoiling, saw the river valley flattening and widening, saw the horizon stained with distant towns, saw the estuary lifting up its blue and silver mouth tongued with green islands. And beyond all, he saw the straight-ruled shine of the sea floating like a rim of mercury on the surface of the brown and white land. The sea rising as he rose, lifting its blazing storm of light, and thundered freedom to the landlocked hawk. Idly, indifferently, he saw it all, as he swung and swayed round the glittering gun sight of his eyes' deep fovea, and watched for a flash or spurt of wings at which to aim his headlong flight. I watched him with longing, as though he were reflecting down to me his brilliant, unregarded vision of the land beyond the hill. He passed across the sun, and I looked away to wring the hot purple from my eyes. When I found him again, he was high to the west of the sun, hidden in the excoriating blueness of the sky till the binoculars drew him down. Head to wind, like a compass needle cleaving to the north, he drifted, steadied, and hung still. His wings closed and curved back, then opened and reached forward, splaying out wide like an owl's. His tail tapered like a dart, then opened in broad spreading fan. I could see the gaps in his wings, where the feathers he shed in December had not yet been replaced. When he banked into the sun, he flashed from blackness to fire, and shone like white steel. Poised on 2,000 feet of sunlit air, he commanded the birds of the valley, and none flew beneath him. He sank forward into the wind and passed slowly down across the sun. I had to let him go. When I looked back, through green and violet nebulae of whirling light, I could just see a tiny speck of dust falling to earth from the sun, flashing and turning and falling through an immense silence that crashed upon in a tumult of shrilling, wing-beating birds. I became aware of my own weight, as though I had been floating upon water, and now was beached and dry and clothed and inglorious again. The hawk had soared for 20 minutes. During all that time, blackbirds had been scolding in the hedge behind me, and partridges had called into the fields. The stoop silenced them like death, and then the only sounds were the whisper and rustle of melting snow, a faint fluttering like a mouse in dry grass, and the tinkle and chime of a small stony stream bearing it down the brook. At 300 feet it came round in a long curve and poised, half hovering. Then it flew forward into the wind towards a skylark singing high above the fields. It had seen the lark go up, and had circled to gain height before making an attack. From behind, the merlin's wings looked very straight. They seemed to move up and down with a shallow flicking action, a free brow pulling sensation much faster than any other falcon's. It reached the lark in a few seconds, and they fell towards the west, jerking and twisting together. The lark still singing, it looked like a swallow chasing a bee. They rushed down the sky in zigzags, and I lost them in the green of the distant fields. Their rapid, shifting, dancing motion had been so deft and graceful that it was difficult to believe that hunger was the cause of it and death the end. The killing that follows the hunting flight of hawks comes with a shocking force, as though the hawk had suddenly gone mad and had killed the thing it loved. The striving of birds to kill, or to save themselves from death, is beautiful to see. The greater the beauty, the more terrible the death. I swung over the hills and down into the deep valley, seeing the tear cell diving down the fan sun's rays towards the distant marshes. I swooped through Leicestershire shafts of green light. A dazzling wetness of green fields irrigated the windswept eye. The humming wheels plunged away below me. I was dragged down in a rush of wind. This was hunting speed, pounding after the winged hawk, quick to the quarry I remembered galloping over springy green turf as a child, over the neglected, fallen farmland of pre-war years, through the wild hedges and glorious wastes of flowering weeds, flaming with hawks and finches. The hawk had seen the movement and had pounced on the partridge before it had finished feeding, had lifted stork and bird together from the ground. He returned an hour later and perched in an apple tree at the edge of open ploughland. I sat and watched him for 30 yards away from all cover. After 2 minutes of uneasy glaring, he flew straight at me as though intending to attack. He swept up into the wind before he reached me and hovered 20 feet above my head, looking down. I felt as a mouse must feel, crouching unconcealed in shallow grass, cringing and hoping. The hawk's keen-bladed face seemed horribly close. The glazed, inhuman eyes, so foreign and remote, swiveled like brown globes in the long sockets of the moustachial bars. The badgered-coloured face was vivid and sharp against the sky. I could not look away from the crushing light of those eyes, from the impaling horn of that curved bill. Many birds are snared in the tightening loop of his gaze. They turn their heads towards him as they die. He returned to the tree, unsatisfied, and I left him alone for a while. An hour before sunset, I lay on the stone slope of the seawall, facing the golden red fire of the dilating sun. The tide dwindled on the mud, the cold air sharpened and began to smell of the coming night. With a roar of wings, like a cliff collapsing into the sea, every bird on the shore rose, leaving it bright beneath a wing-clouded sky. Widgeon flew overhead, sweeping up from the marsh behind the wall. There was a loud smacking sound like a plank hitting mud, a splash of falling excrement, and a harsh whistling of wings. The steeply climbing widgeon fanned apart. One fell back onto the march, huddled and slack, its narrow head hanging golden-crested from the drooping, shaking neck. It looked unreal, as though it had been split sawdust, not dripped blood. It lay where it fell, crumbled and spoiled. The peregrine did not return to its kill while I was near. It had not seen it at all. It killed in the air above me, and I still could not see it, so fast and sudden was its stoop. The peregrine glided away towards the coast. Slowly his speed increased. He was travelling on an immense parabola, and long before his final vertical fall was ended, he had vanished into the hard, clear light of the eastern sky. A green woodpecker called and flew high above the open fields. A jay flew from tree to tree, crossing wearily between the two woods. The first I had seen away from cover since October. Long-tailed fits flitted down from the hedges to collect feathers for their nests from kills the peregrine had made. These birds knew, as I knew, that the peregrine had left the valley. They possessed the freedom I had lost. The estuary was too peaceful, the birds too much at ease. The calm and empty sky was hawkless. On the sea wall I found the body of a carrion crow. A peregrine had killed it not many hours before. Black feathers wreathed its blood-stained bones. Its grim, skull-cracking, eye-piercing bill pointed to the sky. It was a head and wings. At 3 o'clock, I felt suddenly sure that if I went at once to the coast 8 miles away, I should find the peregrine there. Such certainty comes seldom, but when it comes, it is as irresistible as the downward bending of the dorse's twig. I went. It seemed hopeless. Dark clouds gloomed low in the cold north wind, and the light was very bad. The falling tide was far out across the saltings. The fields were as grey and bleak as a distant sea. Land and sea had been beaten flat into the same dull, toneless metal. I love the desolate, but this was beyond desolation. It was dead. A shell duck lay on the mud, shining like a broken vase. Green, black, and white, chestnut, bronze, vermilion. Feathers had been plucked from its breast. Flesh had been sliced from the bone. Deep down inside, the blood was wet. The peregrine had fed. Was he still near? I clambered up the side of the sea wall and looked cautiously over the top. He was there, less than 100 yards away, perching on an overhead wire outlined against the dark inland sky. He must have flown there while I was hidden behind the wall. He faced the wind, waiting for night. Drowsy and unwilling to move. The corn bunting flew up beside him and squeezed out its parched and feeble song. When I went closer, the bunting flew, but not the hawk. At 20 yards, he began to look uneasy. He drifted lightly from the wire, flexed his wings once, and turned, glided downwind. I ran along the path beside the wall and saw him alighting on a fence post on the inland side of the dike. As I approached, he moved farther inland, flitting post to post. When the fences ended, he flew across to a small thorn bush on the far side of the old sea wall. Screened by the low green bank of the wall, I stumble along on my hands and knees towards the place where I think the hawk will be, hoping he will stay till I come. The short grass is dry and brittle and sweet-smelling. It is spring grass, clean and sharp as salt water. I bury my face in it, breathe in the spring. A snipe flies up and a golden plover. I lie still till they are gone. Then I move again, very softly, because the hawk is listening. Slowly the dusk begins to uncoil, not the short wild pang of winter dusk, but the long, slow dusk of spring. Mist stirs in the dikes and furs the edges of the fields. I have to guess where I am in relation to the hawk. 3 more yards. I take the chance. Very slowly, I straighten up and look up over the top of the wall. I am lucky. The hawk is only 5 yards away. He sees me at once. He does not fly, but his feet grip tightly on the thorny twigs of the bush, the ridged knuckles tense and big with muscle. His wings loosen and tremble at the edge of flight. I keep still, hoping he will relax and accept my predatory shape that bulks against sky. The long feathers of his breast are rippled by the wind. I cannot see his color. In the falling gloom, he looks much larger than he really is. The noble head lowers, but lifts again at once. Swiftly now, he is resigning his savagery to the night that rises round us like dark water. The great eyes look into mine. When I move my arm before his face, they still look on, as though they see something beyond me from which they cannot look away. The last light flakes and crumbles down. Distance moves through the dim lines of the inland elms and comes closer and gathers behind the darkness of the hawk. I know he will not fly now. I climb over the sea wall and stand before him, and he sleeps. Be alone. Shun the furtive oddity of man. Cringe from the hostile eyes of farms. Learn to fear. To share fear is the greatest bond of all. The hunter must become the thing he hunts. What is now, must have the quivering intensity of an arrow thudding into a tree. Yesterday is din and monochrome. A week ago you were not born. Persist, endure, follow, watch. I have always longed to be a part of the outward life, to be out there at the edge of things, to let the human taint wash away in emptiness and silence as the fox slows his smell into the cold unworldliness of water, to return to the town as a stranger, wandering flushes of glory that fades with arrival. I came late to the love of birds. For years I saw them only as a tremor at the edge of vision. They know suffering and joy in simple states not possible for us. Their lives quicken and warm to a pulse our hearts can never reach. They race to oblivion. They are old before we have finished growing. The peregrine's view of the land is like the yachtsman's view of the shore as he sails into long estuaries. A wake of water recedes behind him. The wake of the pierced horizon glides back on either side. Like the seafarer, the peregrine lives in a pouring away world of no attachment, a world of wakes and tilting, of sinking plains, of land and water. We who are anchored and earthbound cannot envisage this freedom of the eye. A falcon peregrine, sable on a white shield of sky, circled over from the sea. She slowed and drifted aimlessly, as though the air above the land was thick and heavy. She dropped. The beaches flared and roared with salvos of white wings. The sky shredded up, was torn by whirling birds. The falcon rose and fell like a black billhook in splinters of white wood. She slashed and ripped the air, but could not strike. Tiring, she flew inland. October 5th. A kestrel hovered beside the brook that separates the flat river plain from the wooded hill. He sank slowly down into stubble, lowering like a threaded spider from the web his wings had spun. East of the brook, a green orchid rises to the skyline. A peregrine circled high above it and began to hover. He advanced into the wind, hovering every 50 yards, sometimes staying motionless for a minute or more. The strong west wind was rising to a gale, bending branches, threshing leaves. The sun had gone, and clouds were deepening. The western horizon pricked out black and thorny. Rain was coming. Color ebbed to brilliant chiaroscuro. Between the narrow edges of his long level wings, the hawk's down-bent head looked round and bulky as an owl's. At the side of the lane to the ford, I found a long-tailed field mouse feeding on a slope of grass. He was eating the grass seeds, holding the blades securely between his skinny white front paws. So small, blown over by the breath of passing cars, felted with a soft moss of green-brown fur, yet his back was hard and solid to the touch. His long, delicate ears were like hands unfolding. His huge, night-seeing eyes were opaque and dark. He was unaware of my touch, of my face a foot above him. As he bent the tree-top grasses down to his nibbling teeth, I was like a galaxy to him, too big to be seen. I could have picked him up, but it seemed wrong to separate him now from the surface he would never leave until he died. I gave him an acorn. He carried it up the slope in his mouth, stopped and turned it round against his teeth, flicked it round with his hands like a potter spinning. His life is eating to live, to catch up, to keep up, never getting ahead, moving always in the narrow way between a death and a death, between stoats and weasels, foxes and owls by night, between cars and kestrels and herons by day. October 9th. Fog hid the day in steamy heat. It smelled acrid and metallic. Fumbling my face with cold, decaying fingers, it lay by the road like a Jurassic saurian, fetid and inert in a swamp. As the sun rose, the fog shredded and whirled and died away under branches and hedges. By 11 o'clock, the sun was shining from the center of a great blue circle. Fog burned outwards from its edge like a dwindling white corona. Colour flamed up from the kindled land. Skylarks sang. Swallows and martins flew downstream. The valley, a damp cocoon of mist, rain drifting through, jackdaws elaborating their oddities of voice and flight, their rackety pursuits, their febrile random feeding, golden plover calling in the rain. When a crescendo of crackling jackdaws swept into the elms and was silent, I knew that the peregrine was flying. I followed it down to the river. Thousands of starlings sat on pylons and cables, bills opening wide as each bird had his bubbly, squeaky say. Crows watched for the hawk, and blackbirds scolded. At midday I saw a fox, far out on the saltings, leaping and splashing through the incoming tide. On drier ground he walked. His fur was sleek and dark with wetness, his brush limp and dripping. He shook himself like a dog, sniffed the air, and trotted towards the seawall. Suddenly he stopped. Looking through binoculars, I saw the small pupils of his eyes contract and dilate in their white, flecked yellow irises. Eyes savagely alive, light smouldering within, yet glitteringly opaque as jewels. Their unchanging glare was fixed upon me as the fox walked slowly forward. When he stopped again, he was only 10 yards away. I lowered the binoculars. He stood there for more than a minute, trying to understand me with his nose and ears, watching me with his baffled, barbaric eyes. Then the breeze conveyed my fetid human smell, and the beautiful roan-colored savage became a hunted fox again, ducking and darting away, streaming over the sea wall and across the long green fields beyond. Each flock contained at least 100 birds. The peregrine was clearing the entire hill of its pigeons, stooping at each wood in turn, sweeping along the ridges, flicking between the trees, switchbacking from orchard to orchard, riding along the rim of the sky in a tremendous serration of rebounding dives and ascensions. Suddenly it ended. He mounted like a rocket, curved over in splendid parabola, dived down through cumulus of pigeons. One bird fell back, gashed dead, looking astonished, like a man falling out of a tree. The ground came up and crushed it. He flashed across clouds like a transient beam of sunlight. Then grayness faded in behind and he was gone. All morning the birds were huddled together in fear of the hawk, but I could not find him again. If I too were afraid, I am sure I should see him more often. Fear releases power. Man might be more tolerable, less fractious and smug, if he had more to fear. I do not mean fear of the intangible, the suffocation of the introvert, but physical fear, cold, sweating fear for one's life, fear of the unseen menacing beast, imminent, bristly tusked and terrible, ravening for one's own hot saline blood. Halfway to the coast, lapwings went up as a hawk flew above them. They kept in small flocks, and soon there were 10 flocks in the air together, scattered across a mile of sky. Those that had been up longest flew higher and wider apart, drifting downwind in tremendous circles half a mile across. The most recently flushed stayed lower, wheeling faster and in narrower circles, closely packed, with only small chinks of light between them. When hawks have gone from sight, you must look up into the sky. Their reflection rises in the birds that fear them. November 16th. The valley was calm, magnified in mist, domed with a cold adamantine glory. 50 herring gulls flew north along a thin icicle of blue that wedged the clouds apart. Solemn-winged and somber, moving away into the narrow pincer of blue, they were a splendid portend of the day to come. By 10 o'clock, the blue wedge had widened, and defeated clouds were massing in the eastern sky. Lapwings and golden plover circled down to feed in a newly ploughed field near the river. The first rays of the morning sun reached out to the plover, dim in the dark earth. They shone frail gold, as though their bones were luminous, their feathered skin transparent. The peregrine, which had been hunched and drab in the dead oak, gleamed up in red gold splendor like the glowing puffed-out fieldfares in bushes by the river. When I looked away, the peregrine left his perch and panic began. The southern sky was terraced with mazes of upward winding birds. He had grace and slender strength, she power and solidity. As they dwindled higher and farther to the south, perspective flattened their circles down to ellipses and then to straight lines, gliding incisively to and fro across the sky. Their course seemed curiously inevitable, as though they were moving on hidden wires or following some familiar pathway through the air. It is this beautiful precision, this feeling of preordained movement, that makes the peregrine so exciting to watch. The valley sinks into mist, and the yellow orbital ring of the horizon closes over the glaring cornea of the sun. The eastern ridge blooms purple, then fades to inimicable black. The earth exhales into the cold dusk. Frost forms in hollows shaded from the afterglow. Owls wake and call. The first stars hover and drift down. Like a roosting hawk, I listen to silence and gaze into the dark. His butchery is beautifully done. The carcass weighed only a few ounces, so nearly a pound of meat had been taken from it. The bones were still dark red, the blood still wet. I found myself crouching over the kill like a mantling hawk. My eyes turned quickly about, alert for the walking heads of men. Unconsciously, I was imitating the movements of a hawk as in some primitive ritual, the hunter becoming the thing he hunts. I looked into the wood. In a lair of shadow, the peregrine was crouching, watching me, gripping the neck of a dead branch. We live in these days in the open, the same ecstatic, fearful life. We shun men. We hate their suddenly uplifted arms, the insanity of their flailing gestures, their erratic scissoring gait, their aimless stumbling ways, the tombstone whiteness of their faces. December 1st. The peregrine soared unseen in the blue zenith of the misty sky, and circled east above the coils of gulls. After an hour and a half of idling through the morning sunshine and drifting in the cold southeast wind, he came down to the brook with tremendous swooping force, bursting up a star of fragment birds. A snipe whistled downwind like a shell, and the first great clattering of wood pigeons settled to the long sighing of departing wings. Blackbirds were still scolding when I reached the bridge, but the sky was empty. All the trees to southward, stark against the low glare of the sun, were heavy with pigeons, thick clustered like black fruit. I scanned the sky constantly to see if a hawk was soaring, scrutinized every tree and bush, searched the apparently empty sky through every arc. This is how hawks find his prey and elude enemies, and that is the only way one can hope to find him and share in his hunting. That is how the hawk finds his prey and eludes his enemies, and that is the only way one can hope to find him and share his hunting. Binoculars and a hawk-like vigilance reduce the disadvantage of myopic human vision. At last, yet one of all distant pigeon-like birds till then had proved to be a pigeon, suddenly transformed to peregrine. He flew over southward and soared in the warm air rising from open spaces sheltered by encircling trees. Crisp and golden in the sunlight, he swam up through the warm air with muscular undulations of his wings, like the waving flicker of a fish's fins. He drifted on the surface, a tiny silver flake on the blue burnish of sky. His wings tightened and bent back, and he slid away to the east, a dark blade cutting slowly through blue ice. Moving down through sunlight, he changed color like an autumn leaf, passing from shining gold to pallid yellow, turning from tawny to brown, suddenly flicking out black against the skyline. December 3rd. All day the low clouds lay above the marshes and thin rain drifted in from the sea. Mud was deep in the lanes and along the sea wall, thick ochre mud like paint, oozing glutinous mud that seemed to sprout in the marsh like fungus, octopus mud that clutched and clung and squelched and sucked. Slippery mud, smooth and treacherous as oil, mud stagnant, mud evil, mud in the clothes, in the hair, in the eyes, mud to the bone. On the East Coast in winter, above or below the tide line, man walks in water or in mud. There is no dry land. Mud is another element. One comes to love it, to be like a wading bird, happy only at the edges of the world where land and water meet, where there is no shade and nowhere for fear to hide. At the mouth of the estuary, land and water lose themselves together, and the eye sees only water and land floating upon water. The grey and white horizons are moored on rafts. They move out into the dusk and leave the water land to the ear alone, to the whistling of the widgeon, the crying of the curlew, and the calling of gulls. In long arcs and tangents the hawk drifted slowly higher. From 500 feet above the brook, without warning, he suddenly fell. He simply stopped, flung his wings up, dived vertically down. He seemed to split in two, his body shooting off like an arrow from the tight-strung bow of his wings. There was an unholy impetus in his falling, as though he had been hurled from the sky. It was hard to believe afterwards that it had happened at all. The best stoops are always like that, and they often miss. A few seconds later the hawk flew up from the brook and resumed his eastward circling, moving higher over the dark woods and orchards till he was lost to sight. I searched the fields but found no kill. He fell so fast, he fired so furiously from the sky to the dark wood below that his black shape dimmed to grey air hidden in a shining cloud of speed. He drew the sky about him as he fell. It was final. It was death. There was nothing more. There could be nothing more. Dusk came early. Through the almost dark, the fearful pigeons flew quietly down to roost above the feathered bloodstain in the woodland ride. The silent east wind breathed white frost onto grass and trees and the edges of still water, and the sun did not melt it. The sun shone from a cobalt sky that curved down through pale violet to cold and white horizons. The reservoir glittered in the sun, still as ice, and rippling with duck. Near the brook a heron lay in frozen stubble. Its wings were stuck to the ground by frost, and the mandibles of its bill were frozen together. Its eyes were open and living. The rest of it was dead. All was dead but the fear of man. As I approached, I could see its whole body craving into flight, but it could not fly. I gave it peace, and saw the agonized sunlight of its eyes slowly heal with cloud. No pain, no death is more terrible to a wild creature than its fear of man. A red-throated diver, sodden and obscene with oil, able to move only its head, will push itself out from the sea wall with its bill if you reach down to it as it floats like a log in the tide. A poisoned crow, gaping and helplessly floundering in the grass, bright yellow foam bubbling from its throat, will dash itself up again and again onto the descending wall of air if you try to catch it. A rabbit, inflated and foul with myoxomatosis, just a twitching pulse beating in a bladder of bones and fur, will feel the vibration of your footstep and will look for you with bulging, sightless eyes, Then it will drag itself away into a bush, trembling with fear. We are the killers. We stink of death. We carry it with us. It sticks to us like frost. We cannot tear it away.